Thank you very much. We're going to go next to Dan to tell us a little bit about LEAP, what LEAP has been involved with recently, and specifically what are some of the tactics and strategies that LEAP has used that have been effective to help convert a group that I think most of us assume is not very supportive of our issue, but perhaps we'll find out something different.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. As a currently serving police officer, I'm obligated to throw out a proviso before I say anything, and that proviso is simply that what I have to say here today comes from here. It's from Dan Mulligan. I don't represent the police organization that I work for in any way, shape, or form, nor can I, obviously. So that proviso is very important, and I have to throw that out every time I have any chats with anyone, to be honest with you. So all you Mounties taking notes out there, make sure you make note of the fact that I threw that proviso out there before you make your report to my boss in the morning. I'm here representing LEAP Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. That's a group that was started back in 2002 by a bunch of hard-charging former drug warriors, what we call drug warriors, guys that worked through the 70s and 80s and 90s and retired in early 2000. And these guys were frontline drug enforcement officers with various organizations: New Jersey State Police, Niagara Parks Police, Tonawanda, New York. There was 5 of them that got together in 2002 and said, something's wrong here, guys. We got to try and make an effort and start speaking out against this insane war on drugs. And I'm going to cheat for a few minutes because first of all, I got to admit, I'm not much of a public speaker, so I'm going to cheat and throw out the party line for you before I speak candidly, just so that you know the specifics here. LEAP's mission is to prevent the multitude of unintended harmful consequences resulting from fighting the war on drugs and to reduce the incidence of death, disease, crime, and addiction by ending drug prohibition. LEAP's goals are to, 1, educate the public, the media, and policymakers about the failure of current drug policy by presenting a true picture of the history, causes, and effects of drug abuse and of the crimes related to drug prohibition. And 2, to restore the public's respect for law enforcement. And LEAP's strategy in accomplishing these goals are to create a speakers bureau of knowledgeable and articulate former drug warriors who describe the impact of current drug policies on police and community relations, the safety of law enforcement officers and suspects, police corruption and misconduct, creating and financing crime and terrorism, and treatment and prevention of drug abuse. Now, having said all that, I'm just a dumb Irish cop from Sudbury that is quite frankly tired of seeing our young folks saddled with the yoke of a criminal record around their neck for the rest of their lives for simple possession, P for P, trafficking, for having done stuff that, quite frankly, I did as a young man prior to joining my police organization. And interestingly enough, this was my police interview in early 1983, the first question asked was up in Sudbury, and a guy shows up in suit and tie, and this guy's a professional interrogator. So the first question he asked in my police interview is, okay, lad, I want you to tell me the full extent of your involvement in drug use. You grew up in Sudbury in the 70s. I want to hear about the full extent of your involvement in drug use. Not did you ever smoke dope or he's going for the throat right away. So I had to make a quick decision. Do I bullshit this man or do I tell him the truth? And it was an easy decision because this guy looked like he knew what he was doing. So I said, yeah, for sure. I've dabbled in a little bit of grass and a little bit of hash. I got through high school. I was a hockey player in Sudbury. I wasn't a smoker. I managed to get through high school without doing any drugs, but I ended up at Carleton University. I dabbled in a little bit of marijuana and hashish as an alternative to booze, and quite frankly, I found it for a while to be a pretty good alternative to a little excessive alcohol behavior that I was involved in at the time. So I asked the guy point blank, now that I've been straight with you, I said, is this a showstopper? He says, no, lad, that's not a showstopper. He says, it would have been a showstopper if you had lied to me. So thankfully, I had an interview by a fairly liberal-minded police officer back in 1983. And I've been fortunate in my policing career to have had a wide variety of of policing experience. And I can honestly say that I have never, ever laid a charge of simple possession of cannabis in 31 years of policing, which I am still going. And believe me, that doesn't make me an anomaly among police officers. Believe me, the majority of police officers, I think if you catch them one-on-one, will be very honest with you in terms of how they feel about cannabis right now. And the vast majority of police officers are on the same page as each and every one of you that are here today, I dare say. And part of my motivation behind sitting here in front of you today, scared to death, quite frankly, because this scares me. Part of my motivation involves a young lad that showed up on my doorstep about 4 years ago in tears, and he had just had his first appearance in Bracebridge Court. And he says, "Mr. Mulligan, I had known this kid since he was 5 years old. He'd grown up playing hockey with my young lad." He says, "Mr. Mulligan," he says, I need your help." I said, "What do you need?" He says, "I need a letter of reference to take to a judge on my next appearance." He says, "I got caught with 10 grams on a ride check." I said, "Don't you worry, lad." I said, "You'll get your letter of reference." And out the door he walked. I said, "Make sure you let your folks know what's going on right now," because this kid was obviously upset at the potential consequence of this particular charge. And he was pretty scared. So the letter went through and all that. But at the end of the day, I had been involved in a different avenue of police work for some time in the aviation side of things. And what shocked me at the end of that day was the fact that, one, we were still laying a charge of simple possession on the job, and it's still being done to this day, crazy enough. And the other was the fact that how many kids out there don't have a door to knock on for that reference letter. And those are the kids primarily why I'm here today. And why I'm essentially a Johnny-come-lately to this game. And I look at guys like John Conroy and Mr. Alan Young and Mr. Stroup down the road, and I have nothing but respect for these individuals, having dug into this in the past 4 years since that young lad showed up at my doorstep. I have nothing but respect for you people. The fact that you're here today suggests we're all on the same page. And I'm going to wear another hat later. Right now I'm talking about the LEAP hat. I'm going to wear another hat later in the discussion and discuss how we can all work together in getting over this hump and getting that big rock over the edge of the cliff.
Thank you very much. So next I'd like to go to Keith Stroup, who's with NORML in the United States. As I'm sure everyone has been aware, over the past, I guess, 5 years now, there's been some great success at the state level in terms of states full out legalizing recreational marijuana in Washington and Colorado, and also numerous states over the last 10 years who have seen the light of medical marijuana through large helps of NORML in the United States. So if you could just give us a bit of a rundown about what NORML is involved in, and specifically focusing on what are the tactics that have been effective from going from a fringe issue, if you will, to such a mainstream political issue in the last few years.
Thank you. First off, I want to remind people, if you don't have a history with NORML, that one thing that's a little bit different about us is we're a consumer lobby. That is, when we founded the organization in 1970, it was an outgrowth of some work I had done with Ralph Nader. Ralph had come to Washington, written his book, Unsafe at Any Speed, and he was sort of redefining how you would use your law degree. Instead of trying to just help individual clients, you try to impact public policy. Well, it was the height of the anti-Vietnam War demonstrations. I was a draft evader and doing my best to not get my ass shot off in Vietnam. And I ended up, instead of going to Vietnam, I was fortunate enough, with the help of the National Lawyers Guild, to get a job working for the National Commission on Product Safety. And for 2 years, instead of going to Vietnam, I worked in Washington, D.C. at 16th and K. Now, why that's important is really for two reasons. One is, it radicalized me. I was like a lot of other people of my generation. I had expected to go to law school and go back home and practice law and get rich. I mean, I didn't know what practicing law was about other than attaining property. But the Vietnam War radicalized a whole generation in my country, and especially those of us who were coming out of school and were facing the draft. So when I had a couple of years to work around Ralph Nader, I was really freed up by the idea that maybe I could use what I had learned in law school. I had first smoked marijuana, by the way, when I was a freshman at Georgetown Law School in 1965. I've been a regular smoker ever since, so I guess that means that I'm a long-term smoker now. So I decided I wanted to be a public interest lawyer. By the time the commission ended, I was too old to be drafted. I was 29. So I founded NORML. I wanted to be a public interest lawyer, but the issue that affected me and my generation was not so much product safety and auto safety like Nader, but it was marijuana legalization. We had all learned to smoke when we were in high school or college. I didn't smoke until I was law school, but it was identified with the protest against our policies in Vietnam. When you would go to an anti-Vietnam War demonstration, marijuana was passed up and down all the time. And if you didn't smoke it, you just passed it on. But it was perceived as a symbol saying the U.S. government has gotten way out of the mainstream on this and we need to bring them back in. Well, when the Gallup polling organization had asked the American public for the first time, the year before we started NORML in 1969, for the first time they asked the question of how many Americans support legalizing marijuana. Until '69, they didn't even think it was a serious enough question to ask. And when I look back at the results of those surveys, those polls, it's scary. It was only 12%. 88% of the American public supported keeping marijuana illegal. Only 12% supported what we were trying to do. Now, the reason I want to use that is to explain why we're now making progress in America. It's not because we have finally come up with better arguments, although I hope we've refined them a little over the years. It's largely because we have finally won the hearts and minds of a majority of the American public. And it's not because they're pro-marijuana. Only about 14% of the American public smoke marijuana. 86% do not. And you can't win this issue if you only depend on the support of the smokers. So what we have finally done successfully in America, we've convinced a majority of the non-smokers that prohibition is bad. That just as alcohol prohibition caused more harm to the country than the use of the drug they were trying to suppress, so has marijuana prohibition. Now, it's important to keep that in mind because as we go forward, it's not the committed stoner who we have to keep happy with how legalization works. It's the non-smokers, because otherwise, I guarantee you, we will have a backlash. We know from exit polling in America, especially from Prop 215 in California, when we got 46, almost 47% of the vote, but we lost that one. We found out from the people who refused to support that the two things that mostly concerned them, they weren't opposed to people being able to smoke marijuana and being left alone. They were concerned there might be a big spike in adolescent drug use, marijuana smoking, and that's something we can all identify with. None of us want young kids to be using any drugs. They do a lot, we know that. Most of them turn out okay either way, but I think it makes sense to have a policy that says you ought to discourage any kind of recreational drug use until someone is an adult. And the other area they're concerned about is DUIDs. They're concerned that you're going to have a big spike in the number of stone drivers on the road. Now, that's an interesting concept when you think about it. In America, in the U.S., I should say, we've got over 30 million Americans that smoke every year and 16 million Americans that smoke several times every month. Do they think we've been walking for the last 4 decades? For Christ's sake, we've been driving. So, I mean, I don't think it's a real problem, but that doesn't mean we don't have to pay attention to it. We do. We have to make sure that we are educating our own constituents that you cannot drive when you're impaired. And don't kid yourself. You don't drive better when you're stoned than when you're straight. You do drive better when you're stoned than when you're drunk. There's no doubt about that. But where you really don't want to do is, I'm a person, when I go home every day from work, if I'm not traveling, I pour a glass of wine and roll a joint and watch the news. Well, what the research shows is when you use those two drugs together, it's incredibly impairing, and exacerbates the impact. So what we need to make sure is that we do not unintentionally allow our own culture to get the idea that it's okay to be stoned out of your gourd and get behind the wheel, because if there is a spike in DUIDs, there will be a backlash against further legalization, and it'll impact you people in Canada too, I assure you. Those are the kinds of things they're looking at. Now, again, one thing that's been incredibly important in the United States is that all of our change on social policy starts at the state level, and a little discussion Dana was having about BC leading the way here. Our states have a little more freedom, I believe. I don't know the Canadian system real well, but I think we have a little more freedom to experiment versus our federal government than you may have in Canada. But the one thing we do have to watch for in the U.S. is the supremacy clause of the Constitution. And what the supremacy clause says, in effect, is that if a state passes a law that the courts have said is in positive conflict, that's a legal phrase, but it means what you'd kind of think. You know, if the federal law says you cannot sell marijuana and the state licenses sellers, that's probably a direct conflict. And if you go into federal court, the courts would probably enjoin that. We were fortunate enough when we finally started reaching majority support for legalization in our country. And by the way, that was not until 2011. I told you when we started NORML, there were only 12% support. By 2011, the national polling, including the Gallup poll, started showing for the first time an actual majority. Over 50% of the American public said, I favor fully legalizing marijuana, not just for medical use, but for all adults. And that's continued to grow. The last poll a year ago from Gallup showed 58% of the country nationwide now support full legalization. So we are winning this because we are winning the hearts and minds of the American public. It's a slow process, but I think it's what you have to go through in any country to win. But the feds could have probably shut us down. They could have probably cut this whole momentum we built up, brought it to a halt. If they would have gone into federal court, argued the supremacy clause, they couldn't require a state to make it illegal to possess or use marijuana. A state can just remove their penalties. There's no doubt under American law. But they could have enjoined the part of the law where you license growers and sellers. And that's what this is all about. Consumers, again, we're a consumer group at NORML. We want marijuana that's convenient, safe, and affordable. And by safe, I mean I want it tested in a laboratory. I want to make sure there's no mold or pesticide. I want to know the CBD level and the THC level. And those are things that consumers in any other area want as well, but you couldn't argue that as long as marijuana was a crime. So it's only now that we're getting to the point where we can, at NORML, we can really kick into the parts of the issue that we would rather deal with. But again, I can't stress how important it was that the Obama administration elected, rather than to go in federal court and challenge what was happening in all these states. Remember, we have 21 states and the District of Columbia that have now legalized medical use. And we have 2 states that have legalized adult use, period. We're probably going to win Alaska and Oregon this November. And by 2016, I would bet we'll add 5 more states, probably California, probably Massachusetts, perhaps Rhode Island. And again, it's because the majority of the American people now agree with us. So thank God we had the Obama administration who was willing to say to their Department of Justice, stand back and let those states implement those laws if they can do it in a responsible manner. They issued a series of memoranda called the Cole Memo, and they had 8 different criteria. But essentially what they said was, if a state will make a reasonable effort to minimize diversion, that is, obviously, they don't want marijuana that's legally sold in Colorado showing up in Kansas and Oklahoma, and some of it's bound to, but you know, you got to try to minimize that. And they don't want it as a cover to criminal syndicates. And there's always a little of that, people growing more than they're allowed and selling it out the back door. So in the U.S. right now, the legal marijuana industry, they want the bad actors out of the business. They want to bring this above ground. We want it to be a legitimate business. It works better for business and it works better for consumers. And none of that would have been possible but for Barack Obama's willingness to say, for the rest of my term, you people have a couple of years to prove you can do this in a responsible manner. And frankly, I don't care who's elected in 2016. I think by that point we will have made so much progress there is no turning back. So thank you.
Oh, I think we're ready again. So thank you very much, Keith. That was very informative. As Keith said, you know, in the U.S. they've had a lot of success working through the electoral process, through the ballot initiative process. Dana was trying to use a similar process in BC, but as you heard, it was much more difficult and onerous to get our issue on the ballot as compared to in some of the U.S. states. So that leaves us really working through the traditional democratic process of getting leaders elected who will take up our issue and will hopefully, once elected, create the change that we're looking for. So I'm sure everyone is aware at this point, we have one of our major national parties, the Liberal Party, has come out in support of legalization. Their candidate, Justin Trudeau, has been very open about the issue, even going so far as to admit having used marijuana while sitting as an MP, which I think is no small admission on his part. So let's start with Dan, who is a supporter and works with the Liberal Party. Why should we support the Liberal Party through the next election? And also, can we have confidence in their sincerity to the issue and make sure that this isn't just a chance to take all of our votes and perhaps not implement the change in the future?
I had the privilege of attending the Liberal Biennial Convention in January 2012. And after being a card-carrying progressive conservative at the federal level for approximately at least 25 years prior to that, I discovered Resolution 117 in November of 2011, leading up to the Biennial Convention. And I read Resolution 117 put forward by the BC Young Liberals. And it was an amazing document, quite frankly. And basically it laid out the ground rules for and the proposal for full legalization and regulation of cannabis. And the bottom line is that entire document made a heck of a lot of sense to me. And I was very, very pleased to find it because I was looking for a new party at the time. I had spent a lot of money on the progressive conservatives, and there are no more progressive conservatives in this country. Our country is being run by the damn Reform Party. Pardon my Irish. But the bottom line is that resolution is what got me to Ottawa in January 2012, and I was fortunate enough to speak actually in the debate. And that was a very interesting time. You talk about scared. A room full of 3,500 people, and you're up there basically focused on a jumbotron for the rest of the crowd during the course of the debate. It was a scary time indeed. And I had all of 1 minute to turn around about 89 years of insanity, this prohibition that started in 1923. So I had a minute to make my pitch. And that pitch was quite simple. I just went back into history and discussed the fact that the marijuana prohibition in this country in 1923 was born, in fact, out of racism, pure and simple. In 1923, marijuana was prohibited solely for the purpose of getting rid of the Chinese immigrants that remained behind in the lower mainland BC area after the last spike in the railroad was delivered. And these folks came across, 17,000 of them, came across from the Guangdong province in China in 1885 for the purpose of helping us build our first mega project. And that's how we ended up treating them in 1923, because of the fact that they enjoyed their opium and they enjoyed a little bit of cannabis at the end of the day. We prohibited cannabis for the sole purpose of giving the RCMP wide-ranging search and seizure powers and the ability to deport all these people that were, as a result of them staying behind after the railroad, there was a bit of labor strife going on in the lower mainland. So that was the sole reason that cannabis was prohibited in this country. A lot of people don't realize that. And that's a policy born out of racism, pure and simple. That's a policy that shouldn't have stood in 1923. And after Pierre Elliott Trudeau brought our charter back in 1982, that prohibition is quite frankly unconstitutional, effective when Trudeau brought our Constitution back, because it is discriminatory as discriminatory can be. And I'm actually surprised that there hasn't been, to my knowledge anyway, I'm not up on all the legal challenges of cannabis over the days, but I'm actually surprised that there isn't a legal challenge based on the fact that the policy was discriminatory to begin with and certainly would be unconstitutionally effective 1982 once the charter came in. So that was the argument I had in that whole 1 minute that I had before the crowd. And I was the fifth guy to speak in that debate. And it went to a vote within 5 minutes. And it went to a 77% for versus 23% against. And that was the highest vote of the day on all the new policy resolutions. So let me assure you that this was a room full of 3,500 Liberal delegates from across this country from age 14 to the 90s. This was a very wide array of Canadians, and I would suggest to you very representative of who we have here today. So, and I'm going to throw out the fact that Mr. Trudeau, Justin, at the time, was not in favor of that policy that day. And I want to give credit to NORML Women's Alliance of Canada, Kelly Coulter and her group of ladies, who managed to turn Justin around on this prior to his leadership campaign. And I've got to give Adam Scorgie a plug as well. Adam Scorgie's work on the union, the business behind getting high, is a tool I use to this day when I go out and do what little public speaking I do. I simply show his movie and then have a Q&A afterwards. And I got to give Mr. Scorgie credit for his work, because he has certainly opened up a lot of eyes in this country. But the bottom line is, now that Mr. Trudeau is on side, he's come 180 degrees. He is fully endorsing full legalization and regulation. You can be rest assured that the Liberal Party of Canada, it is formal policy now with the Liberal Party of Canada. And Dana talked about his next resolution, or his next referendum not being available until 2017. I would suggest to you we have a referendum that's about to be handed to us by Mr. Harper himself, ironically enough, when the next writ goes down for a federal election. And we better be there loud and proud. And I suggest to this room right here and now, if you aren't out banging on liberal.ca and throwing in some money in your support, we have an opportunity within the next 16 months to make cannabis legal and regulated. And we cannot afford to miss that opportunity. Thank you.
I'd like to jump over to Dana quickly. Dana, I know that in the past you've been a strong NDP supporter, including running for the party in the past. To those who have not traditionally been Liberal supporters, is this the type of issue that's worth jumping and throwing some support for this one election behind legalization, or do you think this is the time to push on the other parties to improve their policies so maybe there's more choice for the legalization supporter?
Well, you know, it's been challenging for me. I've been an NDP member for over 10 years. We've passed a lot of resolutions provincially with the NDP across the country. Unlike the Liberals, the NDP are unified federally and provincially, so it's more of a one party like that. But certainly there's been resistance, and I know a lot of NDP in the caucus, a lot of NDP MPs in the caucus and members are frustrated with Mulcair's position. People say, oh, Mulcair's the same as Harper, and that's kind of a nonsense thing to say, right? The NDP's voted against all the mandatory minimums. The NDP has been in support of sensible marijuana policies for a long time, but they're very afraid of the L word. They don't want to say legalization. They like decriminalization, which is a word that's very slippery and can mean different things to different people. And so it's been frustrating for me. I definitely think that if Mulcair was Prime Minister, we would roll back mandatory minimums. We'd see a reasonable medical marijuana program put in place. Maybe there'd be a commission to look at how we should deal with marijuana. Maybe they would decriminalize in some way. But certainly the Liberal Party and Trudeau being unified with a strong stance for legalization makes it challenging for me as someone in the marijuana movement to say you should support the NDP. Now, there's certainly many NDP MPs that have earned our support as individuals. Libby Davies has been a longtime champion for marijuana reform and drug policy reform. And so I would say if you're joining a party, I mean, if marijuana is your only issue, and if you're here, then probably it is, and it's hard for me to say anything but to join the Liberals. But I will say this, get involved in the party of your choice. My message has always been not just to join the NDP, but to join a party and make a difference, because only a very tiny percentage of Canadians actually belong to political parties. And that is where these decisions get made. It was a tiny number of people in that room who actually made that vote to support legalization for the Liberal Party. And we see how transformative it's been for the whole country. And so get involved in the Liberal Party, make sure they're going to do it when they pass it. Because it's easy when you're the third party to make promises, but when you're in power, it's hard always to follow through on those. So let's make sure that that Harper is defeated, and that if Justin's our next Prime Minister, that he follows through on that and makes it happen. And I've been thinking about changing parties. Right now, I'm staying in the NDP. I'm not going anywhere. I want to continue to work to make the NDP, good on this issue and stronger on this issue. But my message is join the party of your choice. We should be a time when all parties support legalization. There should be a time when the Conservatives, the Progressive Conservatives under Joe Clark, did support legalization. We had a time when both parties, Liberals and Conservatives and NDP, all three of them supported legalization or reform in the 70s. And then the Conservatives went a different way. So we need people in every party. There are plenty of Conservatives, including at least one Conservative MP, who support legalization as well. Wouldn't it be wonderful if all parties in Parliament supported that? If it was an issue like gay marriage or those kind of issues where even those who are against it, they don't get to talk. They're told to shut up because they know this is not going to go over well with the Canadian public. That's when we've really had our victory, when all parties and all viewpoints, the dominant one is for legalization. There you
go. Next, I'd like to go to Gillian. The Coalition is a nonpartisan group, so I'm curious, when you see an array of views amongst the parties, from looking just at the cannabis issue, of legalization with the Liberals, perhaps a decrim, but we're never quite sure, with the Conservatives, and then the NDP coming in the middle with more studies. How does the Coalition sort of interact with these political groups, and do you put any support behind any of the parties?
Well, we don't support any particular party because we don't believe in that. I just heard Dana say a lot of ifs at the end of his amazing talk just now. If Mr. Harper doesn't get in, and if the Liberals do, and you can't really put all your eggs in one basket if there's too many ifs. And so we believe that you have to do as much as you can, as Dana ended up saying, working with all the parties. Remember when I said in Vancouver that we ended up in 2002 with all the mayors from all the different political parties saying that they supported harm reduction? That's where we need to get. I don't know if we'll get there next year in 2015, but we need to do our best to do that. So CDBC is really can do, we think we have two important things we can do. One is not to, by the way, negate what Mr. Trudeau has said. It's a huge gift what he's given us. It really does move the whole conversation in such a higher level than ever before. So it's tremendously exciting. Not to say we don't support him, but we can't say that we only just support him, because who knows what's going to happen. Politics is a wild world. So two things we can do, and we have already. We received a very generous grant from Bob Erb at the late summer last year, and so we are in the process of finalizing a very detailed policy document that we can take to any political person and policymaker of all stripes to say exactly how cannabis should be legally regulated. And the other thing that we think we can bring is our national presence and our connections and our way of connecting with Canadians in dialogue. So we're very interested in bringing these issues to the forefront, coming up to the next election, and finding ways to engage Canadians across the country in different provinces. There's different issues, and we really have to get people out to talk about them and say why it's important. And then their politicians, who are all running and who all want to have them vote for them, will actually start to listen if the general public are educated and informed and start calling for change. So that's basically where we stand.
For Keith, in the United States, obviously the big successes come through the ballot initiative, which is more of the individuals getting out to vote for the specific issues. Are you seeing any change over the last few years in terms of either at a party level or at a politician, at a candidate level, people coming out in support of legalization? And if you are, how is NORML, if they're doing so, helping to support those candidates?
Well, you're absolutely right that every victory we've had with full legalization to date, only two, but Colorado and Washington were voter initiatives, and the two that are going to happen this November are also voter initiatives. And I think what people have to simply understand is that this is one of those issues where the average person is ahead of your elected officials. There's no doubt. It's sort of like the gay rights issue, or the gay marriage issue, at least in the United States. You can almost see those two issues tracking up. And politicians were running for cover because they were used to thinking that if they supported either one, legalizing marijuana or gay marriage, they were probably going to lose at the next election. And then all of a sudden, they're realizing these things are passing all over the country. Well, we've got to recognize elected officials primarily are interested in getting reelected. And so they're always going to be a little slow to move on these kinds of issues. In the U.S., only 24 of our 50 states have a voter initiative process, and we do not have one federally. So for half of our country, we have no choice but to do it the old-fashioned way. We've got to win enough support from elected officials, and that's why I'm not projecting we're going to win that first victory by legislature until 2016. I think by then we will. One of the positive things we have seen in states like Colorado in particular, because they've had more time to roll out the legal market, congressmen like Jared Polis, for example, from Boulder, when he talks about how enthusiastic he is about the legalized marijuana systems they have in Colorado, and they have two. They first legalized medical use and then came back a few years later and legalized full adult use. He talks about how it helps seriously ill patients, and he has all the arguments that we all make. But what he really gets excited about are the tens of thousands of new jobs that have been created, the young entrepreneurs who've been attracted to Colorado to bring their high-tech money in and start new businesses. There is a green rush going on in Colorado and about to happen in Washington that I do not think neighboring states are going to be able to ignore very long. Now, I will say this, I'm an old guy, and I remember when you could only gamble legally in one state in America, that was Nevada. Then they went to New Jersey. Now, the other 48 states knew they could make money off gambling, but as long as it was considered sinful, or, the religious community felt that it was inappropriate conduct, most states were just not willing to use that revenue stream to pay their bills. We're going through that same process right now. There's still a lot of southern states and conservative states in the U.S. where legalizing marijuana is still a little bit like gay marriage and gambling. You're not quite sure it's okay. It's a little libertine or something. But Colorado expects to raise $100 million in tax revenue this first year alone from the legal sale of marijuana, $100 million. And I guarantee you, every other state could do the same thing. Colorado's not even one of our biggest states population-wise. Can you imagine what California could do? So I do think that a lot of what's happening is, as the issue comes above ground, and as American public and elected officials can deal with it on a more rational basis, there simply is no strong argument to allow your citizens to drive 50 miles into a neighboring state and spend their money like they used to with gambling, going to a casino in Nevada. They don't go there now. They can do it in their home state in most states. So the same thing is going to happen with marijuana. I do believe in the end, once you stop arresting smokers, you concede that it's not a moral offense, it's not something you should engage the criminal law. then the financial argument is just overpowering. It is the largest new supply of revenue available to any state in our country, and I suspect in yours as well. So I think what we're going to continue to try to do is to mainstream the issue. Again, I don't think it's a time when we need to have a lot of smoke-ins and protests and block the traffic and raise hell. We're winning this the old-fashioned way, and I think we just need to continue doing what we're doing for about another 5 years. I think within 5 years, we will stop arresting marijuana smokers all across America, even in the Deep South. It may take a little while longer for them to actually license retail outlets. There are some counties in Alabama and Mississippi where you still cannot buy a legal drink of alcohol. Under our system, when the federal government backs out, they don't dictate what the states do. They just back out and the states get to do what they want. So there will be some states that will be slow to finally legalize marijuana, but the majority of states will do it in the next 5 years.
I could just add something that I forgot to say. So thinking about those dialogues and building on what Keith said earlier, we really do need to appeal to the general public, to just regular people that don't really smoke cannabis. And so what we need to do is engage them and talk about their fears. And generally, it is about youth. It is about young kids. And it's always the pushback from the government, protect the kids, protect the kids. And it's really a shallow pushback. And we have to be able to articulate that and explain that to the average person that doesn't really understand very well. And that's the opportunity with this next election. And I think Canada is such a big country that we can't really have town hall meetings everywhere in the country, probably, being realistic. So then we have to get a little strategic and look where those swing ridings are and look where there are opportunities and really focus on those areas and start just to talk to people. Exactly what Keith said. It really is those people that will make the shift, and we have to make them feel comfortable about doing it.
Thank you, Gillian. Just moving on, we're running a little bit short on time, and I want to make sure we have time for questions at the end. Dana, I'm interested to know, in coming out of the Sensible BC campaign, you heard Keith talk about the need to convert the non-smoker to our cause, so the moms and the dads of all of us, if you will. To what extent was Sensible BC able to be successful in doing that? And very importantly, how were you able to interact and bring these people on board?
Well, we thought about that kind of stuff because, you know, we don't have any pot leaves on our logo, and we chose the name Sensible BC. And although, you know, a lot of our core organizers are definitely pro-marijuana, we try to portray ourselves as an organization more as anti-prohibition, because you want to welcome people who aren't into smoking pot but want to make change. What I found was that out of our volunteers, senior citizens were a much greater number of volunteers than I expected. And actually retired school teachers and principals were quite a large number, proportional overall. There's definitely young folks that got involved too, but people are always like, oh, young people are going to be all over that. And it's like, well, no, actually, and people who don't want to sign, often younger people are more resistant or less politically engaged in that way. I think partly it's that there's a cynicism that younger people maybe reject the whole concept of getting politically involved, whereas people that are older are more likely to be voters, more likely to be engaged, and maybe they feel they have less to lose or something. But definitely, you know, and yet, although we didn't put pot leaves on stuff, I go to the grocery store and I see every product that has hemp in it sticks a pot leaf on their stuff to sell it. So I'm like, well, maybe marijuana leaves aren't scaring people off. I mean, you go to a body shop and it's got their hemp leaves are all over the place. But we tried to portray ourselves without having that kind of imagery and to draw it that way. And I think that was the right choice. And to create a sensible kind of group. But definitely, I found, to my surprise, and still that case now, that older people are much more of our volunteer base and much more involved. And I think that's great, because I think that's kind of the face that we want, and the fact that that's the group that votes more is also, I think, important.
That's great. Dan, in terms of working with law enforcement against prohibition, what are ways that non-law enforcement individuals can interact with those groups and help, you know, bring more of law enforcement on board with legalization, I guess at an official basis, because you say individually a lot of them already support. And in addition, are there any particular associations or groups of policing authorities that we can interact with and perhaps target more to be effective towards getting legalization?
Absolutely. Our LEAP members on a regular basis are speaking to various service clubs throughout the world. LEAP is active in over 80 countries right now. And we spend a lot of time speaking to various service organizations, Rotary, Kiwanis, Civitan groups, church groups, church breakfast groups. That was an interesting one. And we're going to start targeting police associations because we have a lot of like-minded people in our police organization, to be perfectly honest with you. You get a police officer alone and he'll be a lot more candid than if he's with a group of his friends. One good example is I was taking a bit of heat over my license plate in a bar in Bracebridge about 6 months back. I have the Ontario license plate legalized, and it causes a bit of a stir around town and around the office for sure. And we're sitting in the bar up in Bracebridge, and I've got 8 fellow coppers enjoying my drug of choice right now, a cold beer. And we're sitting around, and they're ribbing me about my plate and all the crap that was getting me into at work. And I said, okay, boys, just shut up. Let's have a little straw poll right here and now. There was 8 of us at the table. I said, I want a show of hands. Which one of you would not be sitting here today enjoying the occupation you are presently enjoying if you suffered the full wrath of your involvement, your minimal involvement in cannabis as a youth? Well, not one of those officers could put his hands up. So the bottom line is, believe it or not, there are a lot of like-minded people within our police organizations across this country. So one of our targets, especially in the course of the next 16 months, is police associations in the whole. And I have plans to go to our OPPA AGM in October up at Deerhurst, and I'm probably going to be playing Adam Scorgie's new film, The Cultural High. It should be out by that time. So I'm looking forward to playing that. That's always an eye-opener. I love the man's work. He does a great job. And that's one example of what we're going to be up to in terms of targeting police associations, and simply play a good piece of work like that, and then have a good Q&A among the crowd, and you'd be surprised what comes out of that.
Thank you very much. Before we open the floor to questions, I just want to end with Keith, through your experiences in the U.S., what do you think is the biggest lesson learned that we can take home with us to go from being at the cusp of legalization to actually getting over that hurdle and being able to say Canada is somewhere where you can enjoy, buy, and produce legal marijuana?
Well, I think probably 2 points or 2 elements play into that. One is that we have to encourage more responsible, mainstream, middle-class smokers to come out of the closet. We have still to overcome some negative stereotypes. Now, not every smoker can come out of the closet because we don't want them to lose their job or lose custody of their kids. But if you're in a situation where you can, where you're self-employed or you're retired or whatever, if you are a marijuana smoker or have been, let people know it so they get over those negative stereotypes. Marijuana smokers are just average citizens who work hard and raise families and pay taxes and contribute in a positive way to their communities. So we need to do more of that. And one other element simply is historical. In the U.S., when alcohol was first prohibited, women and mothers played a major role in convincing the country we had to make alcohol a crime. And at the end of alcohol prohibition, it was 12, 13 years later, Pauline Sabin, another woman, led a group of women who played a major role in repealing alcohol prohibition. And the reason they did it was because people want to hear about what's good for children and families from women. Believe it or not, all of the surveys show that. They're more trustworthy in that regard. So a few years ago at NORML, we, having gone back and reviewed some of that history, we formed the NORML Women's Alliance. I heard Dan gave them a credit here in Canada for doing some good work, and they're doing great work in the U.S. So one of the things I would suggest going forward is get more women involved and get them out front, because a lot of the concerns people have about ending prohibition, they want to be reassured by a woman that it's not going to be something bad for the kids.